You know, World War I wasn't just a war fought in trenches with artillery or with bayonets. The war wasn't limited to soldiers, generals, and armies. There was a silent, hidden, and arguably deadlier front, the financial front. A war that raged in gold reserves, bond markets, central bank offices, and the private ledgers of financiers who never set foot on the battlefield. Soldiers paid the price in blood, while bankers and governments battled over balance sheets. What's remarkable is that the financial decisions made during those years not only influenced who would win or lose, but also fundamentally reshaped the global financial system in ways that still affect us today. If you still think the war was only about armies and politics, think again. In 1914, Europe was a powder keg ready to explode. National rivalries, colonial ambitions, and complex military alliances had turned the continent into a paranoid chessboard. But behind all the grand speeches, heroic anthems, and public posturing lay a harsh reality. A war of this scale required unimaginable amounts of money. And here's the bitter truth. When leaders decided to go to war, they also committed their populations to future debts. Every soldier sent to the front was, in effect, adding a burden to the nation's economy. At the start, governments were still optimistic. The war will be short. Maybe it'll be over by Christmas, they thought. They assumed they could pay for it the old-fashioned way. Gold, limited borrowing, patriotic donations. But within weeks, that illusion shattered. The war was burning money faster than anyone could have imagined, and governments were unprepared for it. At that time, Europe's financial system still revolved around the gold standard. Paper money could be exchanged for gold, which provided credibility, but also restricted government actions. Gold reserves were finite, and printing endlessly would risk the trust of citizens and creditors alike. Britain, France, and Germany had respectable reserves, but once millions were mobilized and industry redirected toward weapons, costs skyrocketed. Germany alone was spending 10 million marks per day by late 1914, while Britain's war expenses soon reached £2.5 million per day. The math was merciless. Gold wouldn't last, so governments began suspending the rules. One by one, the major powers abandoned the gold standard, quietly admitting that money was now essentially backed only by faith in the state. That moment, the breaking of the gold anchor, was a turning point in modern financial history. It exposed how fragile so-called real wealth really was. Money was no longer tethered to metal. It was driven by printing presses, credit, and persuasion. Once governments tasted that freedom, there was no turning back. The financial war had officially begun. Germany, isolated from global capital markets and blockaded by the Royal Navy, had only one option: domestic borrowing. Berlin launched massive bond drives, appealing to patriotism and urging ordinary citizens to invest their savings in war loans. Propaganda was everywhere. Posters of heroic soldiers, families urged to sacrifice luxuries, constant promises that investors would be repaid after victory. Germany raised over 100 billion marks this way, but it was a pyramid built on hope. When defeat came, those bonds became worthless. Millions of Germans lost their life savings, and that resentment later became fertile ground for extremism. Britain, on the other hand, had a massive advantage. London was the financial capital of the world. Sterling was trusted, and British financial networks reached across the globe. Initially, the government relied on short-term borrowing and patriotic appeals, but soon it tapped into the deeper pools of global credit. Crucially, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America was officially neutral, but bankers smelled opportunity. Firms like J.P. Morgan & Co. became the financial lifeline of Britain and France, arranging vast loans and managing purchases of weapons, food, and raw materials. By the time the U.S. entered the war in 1917, Wall Street had already been bankrolling the Allies for years. This wasn't charity, it was power. American bankers earned millions, and the U.S. transformed from a debtor nation into the global financial leader. France faced its own struggles. Already weakened by the cost of building defenses in previous wars, French citizens were persuaded to buy government bonds. Yet the deeper financing again came from across the Atlantic. This dependence would profoundly shape post-war politics and debt crises. Russia, meanwhile, was a disaster. Its empire was vast but underdeveloped, banking fragile, and gold reserves impressive on paper but insufficient in practice. To fund the war, Russia borrowed heavily from allies, particularly France, but defeats mounted. Inflation soared, and by 1917 the economy collapsed, and the political system fell with it. The fall of the Tsarist regime wasn't just about ideology. It was about a financial system stretched to its limit. By the end of the war, the Allies had spent over $140 billion, and the Central Powers around $60 billion. These were sums the world had never seen. The result wasn't just mountains of debt. It was the destruction of the old financial order. The gold standard was shattered. Inflation ravaged economies. Germany experienced hyperinflation, and ordinary people bore the brunt, while elites safeguarded their wealth. The war showed that governments could finance the unimaginable by detaching money from reality. They could suspend gold, print endlessly, issue bonds to citizens, borrow across borders, and then patch the ruins later with propaganda. Sound familiar? Today, central banks say inflation is temporary. Governments raise debt ceilings, and new money is conjured digitally at the stroke of a key, and millions still fall for it. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, the world was a battlefield not just in trenches, but in balance sheets. The U.S., which had been a debtor nation, now held the world's largest gold reserves and creditor position, while Europe was drowning in debt. Wall Street had replaced London as the center of global finance. But here's the trap. Debt-funded wars create their own wars. Germany was forced to pay reparations, leading to the 1923 hyperinflation crisis and massive losses for ordinary citizens. Britain tried to restore the pound to its pre-war value, causing deflation, unemployment, and unrest. The U.S. pumped money back into Europe, maintaining a circular debt cycle. The financial structure of the 1920s looked stable, but was fragile. When the Great Depression hit, it all collapsed. World War I was not just a war of soldiers. It was a financial war. Governments learned that money could be used as a tool of manipulation, and ordinary people always paid the price. Look at your life today. Central banks say inflation is temporary, debt ceilings rise, money is created with a keystroke. Remember 1914? The gold standard was abandoned deliberately. Borrowing, printing, and patriotic bonds are over a century old. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And if you fail to learn, you'll pay the price.